Hello, my name is Tom Cronin. In 1991 and 1992, I conducted a comprehensive series of interviews on camera with a diverse, often eclectic cross-section of Orleans residents. Some I knew personally, others I had never met. All had a solid connection to Orleans. The intent of these interviews was to record through the eyes of the people and their experience, their history of the town. Funding for the series was provided by a generous grant from the Community Preservation Council of $18,000 and a further contribution of $12,000 from American Heritage Realty, now Cape Cod Ocean View Real Estate. I sincerely hope you enjoy our series, In Those Days, Historic Voices of Orleans.
I've always been interested in archaeology. I grew up in Harwich, and I remember from the age of even like 6 or 7 being really interested, and I was lucky enough to pursue it in college, and I received a bachelor's degree in anthropology from Harvard in 1980. I worked for a year in the Cape Cod Archaeological Survey with the National Park Service, and then I went to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where I got a master's in '85, and I'm still there as a doctoral candidate. I've been here at the museum since the summer 1982, working as a staff archaeologist.
Can you tell me something about the field work that you've done in this area, and in particular the Orleans area?
I've done a lot of work on the Outer Cape. One of my major points of interest is coastal adaptations, how prehistoric people adapt to coastal environments, and how the changing environment affects their adaptations. And so I spent a lot of time looking at Pleasant Bay, and a lot of time working around the Orleans area. In the summer of 1989, we did a small project at Boland's Pond in the center of town. And this last summer, we spent the whole summer over at Pochet Neck, or Poche, and we plan to return there next summer. So I would say that the whole Pleasant Bay area, the greater Pleasant Bay area, is one of my greatest areas of interest.
And you've been working in the Orleans area for how many years in the field, really?
In the field, probably the first project I did, the first project I was associated with was in the summer 1985. I ran the research lab here at the museum for the Oak Ridge project, which is where the wastewater treatment plant is now, and that was a project that Public Archaeology Lab was doing. And what we did, this is really an interesting thing for us, is they were actually excavating the site, and Leonard Lepardo of Orleans was the principal investigator, and he and I coordinated a field lab here at the museum. And what we would do is we would receive the artifacts every day from the excavation crew, and we set up a living exhibit at the museum where we spent time washing the artifacts in front of the public. They would come and visit the museum and see the material from the site in Orleans, which dated to about 3,000 years ago. So that was my first experience. And then the summer of '89, I did a field project at Boland's Pond, a small project, and this past summer over at Pochet Neck. But in terms of writing and research interest, I started doing research on the greater Pleasant Bay area, including that part of Orleans, back in the summer of 1986, and published a report, or presented a report to the Friends of Pleasant Bay, who actually supported that research, in the fall of 1987. So I would say it goes back to '85, '86, where I've had a research interest in Orleans. I think the significance of the Coast Guard beach find is it puts people on the outer Cape at 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. When we look at the Cape today, we think that the Cape then looked like the Cape today. Shoreline was where it is today, and that's not true. The sea level was so low that you could have walked miles offshore to the east. So that the Cape was really an interior location when people first came here 10 or 11,000 years ago. What really made the Coast Guard beach site so important, I think, was that it clearly demonstrated the antiquity of the Outer Cape, and also I think the way it was excavated, saving the site as it was eroding, the effort that went into that, and certainly the fact that the site was reported to, the Park Service made it important, because we lose sites like that all the time unless people take the time to report them. 10,000 years ago, Orleans would have looked very different from what it looks like today. Shoreline would have been miles and miles and miles to the east. So you would have been looking out at a forested area where the ocean is now, perhaps a grassy plain. Town Cove, for instance, was probably a large freshwater body, or in fact maybe a large bog system. The woodland was probably a mix of conifers and deciduous trees. Just at that time, the deciduous trees would have been reaching the Cape as they migrated northward after recession to the south during the glacial period. The population that lived here would have been organized in small bands of people, 30 to 40 people, that moved all across the landscape, out to the east where there would have been a shoreline where they could have hunted birds and seals. Perhaps there were established estuaries out there. Perhaps they moved back in then toward Orleans in the wooded upland area of the Cape during the winter. Small populations that were highly mobile moved with the seasons as resources became available in different parts of the landscape in different seasons. The original occupants of North and South America came across the Bering Strait on the land bridge 12 to 13,000 years ago. And one of the most interesting things is how rapidly that population dispersed across the two continents. So ultimately, the people that arrived at the Cape and in Orleans, say 10, 11,000 years ago, were descendants from of that initial population. And one of the things that's interesting is across that broad geographic area, the cultural traditions at that time were all very similar. And so we find that the people that were living in the Outer Cape area 10 or 11,000 years ago had very similar toolkits and material culture as groups living in the southeast. And I think groups that arrived in southern New England, and particularly on the Cape and Islands 10 or 11,000 years ago, it's my belief that they were moving up the eastern seaboard on the exposed continental shelf, moving into the interior by following the drainages, which would have, of course, led them into the Cape, looking to place themselves in areas where important resources became available seasonally. So the fish run during the spring would put them near a creek or a tributary. Hunting was probably a pretty constant activity, but there may have been a time of the year, fall or winter, where deer hunting was more important than at other times. And they were probably more gatherers and fishers and collectors than hunters. And I think that's one of the misnomers, is that hunting provided so much of the diet. And it was actually the daily activity, generally by women, of collecting and gathering and fishing that provided the mainstay of the diet. Hunting was very important because it provided large packages of protein all at once, and then you might go for a week without a deer or a turkey or something like that.
Getting back to the site now on Pochet Road, you call that site officially
The Cruisin' Rainey site, after the two people that own the property, and its official designation for the records of the Mass Historical Commission, it's 19 BN 657. And that stands for, 19 is the state number, BN is for Barnstable County, and this is site number 657.
Mm-hmm. That dates back, according to your calculations, to the 3,500.
Right. The earliest occupation was somewhere around 3,500 years ago, and people used that site, prehistoric peoples, more or less continuously up until 400 or 500 years ago. The site may be older than that, but we don't have anything that predates 3,500 years. But we've also looked at just such a small part of the site. People that were living in Orleans and using this site at 1500 BC, they were the descendants of those original groups that came to the Cape at 10,000 or 11,000 years ago. They differed in a number of ways. Their adaptations would have been different because shoreline had reached where it is now. Sea level had reached where it was at 3,500 years ago, and or roughly that period. And so these people would have had a much more of a marine focus in their adaptations. The population density was greater. They moved far less frequently and shorter distances, lived in larger communities. I think there was a greater complexity culturally, socially, politically than we get a picture of in the archaeological record. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind. Farming became important sometime after 1000 AD here on the Cape. Prior to 1000 AD, the people may have had access to corn, beans, squash, tobacco, and may have been experimenting with small gardens. But agriculture really intensified after 1000 AD. In terms of permanent settlement, they probably lived in large, fairly settled communities at the major estuaries for most of the year, dispersing to small inland sites during the worst part of the winter. And when you say inland, it's interesting because you mean generally quarter to a half mile from the coast, but into an area where you get a little more topography and you can get down in a hole or a hollow on a south-facing slope out of the north wind, and that was probably what they were doing in the worst part of the winter. But as we know, there are winters that are very mild, and that they may not have moved at all during that period. Mm-hmm. Well, we know historically that the types of houses they were building were circular huts made of bent saplings framed with woven mats. So probably they were living in similar structures at that time. Archaeologically, we have very little evidence for house structure at 2000 BC, but there may have been clay floors, and they have a hint of that from our site in Orleans, where we have clay, thick lenses of clay within the midden itself that look perhaps like prepared living surfaces. If you could have been on the Cape in 1491, and it's my personal belief that perhaps and most probably there were fishermen from Europe and traders from Europe that were around the Cape at 1500 AD. If you could have seen a village at that time, you would have seen a group of people that lived around one of the estuaries, one of the areas around Pleasant Bay, one of the interior, say one of the coves or rivers or something like that. They would have lived in dispersed farmsteads, houses, circular houses with thatched with woven mats, with a garden around the house, corn, beans, squash, pumpkins, tobacco. Women tended the gardens generally, men tended the tobacco gardens. Clamming, fishing, collecting, gathering would have been primary activities. Men would have hunted deer and gone in wooden dugout canoes offshore to fish for tuna, swordfish, bass. Weirs and nets would have been used in the bay itself to catch smaller fish. Seals were taken during the winter time. Drift whales, when they come ashore, like the pilot whales that are stranding now, were a tremendously important resource for the native peoples, because the whales tend to strand in the colder part of the year when there's not a lot of other foods available. The whales would have been really important in the diet of the native peoples. Indeed, one of the first things the pilgrims saw when they came to the Cape was two or three native people cutting up a grampus. Indeed, at our site in Orleans, at Pochet Road, we have whale bones, small whale bones, or fragments of whale bones in the site, so we know that they were using whales. We know historically that all of the major estuaries had major communities. There was Monomoyet at the southern part of Pleasant Bay. Nauset Inlet had the group that we refer to as the Nauset people. Aspinet was their sachem. At Monomoyet, it was Mataquason. In Brewster, along the bay, we had Saquatucket, where Wano and Sachem, father and son, were sachems. We had Iano at Barnstable Harbor. These were large communities of 500 or more people with very distinct territorial bounds and very, very distinct political leadership and social rules.
And you're still talking about the period of, you're talking about later.
Around, say, 1490, you know, we would have, that's the way the Cape would have looked. The interesting thing was, and very unfortunate thing was that between 1617 and 1619, there was an illness that originated in the coast of Maine, probably brought by French fishermen. And that illness swept along the coast, from the southern coast of Maine all the way to the southern coast of Massachusetts. And the mortality was close to 90%. But for some reason that we don't know, the Cape may have been spared by that illness. And it was probably something as simple as a flu. I mean, the people that lived here for 10, 12,000 years, they had very naive immune systems. The Jesuits describe, they were living amongst the native peoples in Maine, and they just give the descriptions of the illness, and they themselves didn't become ill. That really set the stage for the success of the settlement at Plymouth, because the people that settled Plymouth moved into an essentially abandoned area, and they described that area as being abandoned. Seeing communities 7 miles west of Plymouth where there were literally bones scattered on the ground, and being at Boston Harbor in 1622 and talking to people there who'd talk about the people that were gone. But when they talk about the Cape, they never describe the illness. They describe large populations like in the East Ham Orleans area of more than 500 people. So there were large settlements, and those settlements were very important to the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims came down regularly from the period between 1620 and 1622 to trade with the communities at Pleasant Bay for corn. And one interesting anecdote that you find in Bradford and Winslow is that in 1622, when they were at Pleasant Bay trading for corn, they weren't able to get all they wanted because the native peoples were getting a better price from the Dutch, who were coming up from New York. So they held on to some of the corn to trade there.
When did Samuel Champlain sail into Nauset Harbor?
He was there in 1605, and then came back again in 1606, and then sailed south to Chatham, where he spent some time.
He described that map. It's an authentic map.
Yeah, that's his description of what Nauset Inlet looked like in July of 1605 when he was there, and it's one of the best maps of the whole coast. That's where in 1620 we have the Pilgrims meeting those people and learning that their sachem was a man named Aspinet, who was an important figure. It's really, Bradford and Winslow provide so many details about what the Cape looked like at that point.
And what is Bradford and Winslow?
They wrote Mort's Relation, and then they wrote, Bradford was the first governor of the colony and wrote about the years there to come. He wrote a history of Plymouth Colony. Mm-hmm. The Outer Cape, the Orleans-Brewster area, began to be settled in the mid-17th century. So for a period, there were native peoples living amongst Euro-American peoples without, as we read the record, any major problems. Unfortunately, more and more land was purchased by ever-increasingly large numbers of settlers, and many native peoples moved to Mashpee. A lot of men went to sea, unfortunately were lost, and the native community, the Outer Cape, really declined between 1700 and 1800, and I'm sure there are native peoples living around the Outer Cape today, but unfortunately between 1700 and 1800, many of them unfortunately passed on. These are some of the artifacts from the Cruise and Rainey site at Pochet. We have some well-preserved fishbone here, projectile points, smoking pipe, and this is more or less representative of the entire assemblage. I think we just really sampled a real small percentage of the site, maybe 5% of what's there, so I expect that next year we'll get quite a bit more. This is very well-preserved fishbone. It's somewhere around 1,000 years old. This is a fish scale. We collected this in this manner to show how well things were preserved at the site. And we'll have a specialist who analyze this fishbone, look at this, and tell us what species is represented here, or if there are more than one species. But this gives you an idea of how well preserved the site is. This is a projectile point that dates to about 1,500 years ago, the Middle Woodland period. It's made out of local material, and you can see how it's been resharpened right at the tip. There are indentations on either side. The material is a quartzite and would have been available in local beach cobbles, which is where most of the stone tool material came from.
This is such a small point. What would they have used this for?
Probably it was attached to an arrow. A lot of people think that all stone points that are found are arrow points. Indeed, most of them are probably spear or dart points. But this small point was probably affixed to an arrow. And Champlain describes the arrows as being roughly 5 feet long. And I believe that was probably an arrow tip. Okay, what we have here is a ceramic pipe. We have a bit of the stem and most of the bowl with a fragment missing right here. The pipe gives us an important indication that these people were indeed agricultural and were growing tobacco as a crop. Champlain notes that women tended all of the gardens, the corn, beans, squash, and men tended the tobacco garden, and that's probably because tobacco had some ritual significance. This is the earliest artifact that we have from the site, and it was found probably 10 to 20 centimeters below the midden, and is of a type, I believe initially we were thinking 3,500 years old, but it could be much older. But just having this one specimen doesn't really allow us to draw a conclusion about the earlier part of the site assemblage. But I believe this is at least 3,500 years old, and gives us an idea that the site was used for a long period of time, from 3,500 years ago right up until several hundred years ago. And it's really finely serrated. You can see the beautiful serrations along the edge. It's made of local material, felsite, again probably from a large cobble, and it's a really beautiful specimen. This is a large ceramic sherd dating to about 700 years ago, found at the site, and it's a rim. You can see the rim right here. This is actually finished, and then beautiful incisions along the edge of the bowl, probably made by some type of could have been the edge of a shell or a bone tool. And this is very typical of the pottery of that time. It's a clay paste mixed with a shell temper and then fired at very low heat. This is a really nice example of prehistoric ceramics, and very typical of the coastal late woodland period.
So this would have probably been a bowl of some
A cooking
sort.
bowl or a bowl for storage.
Mm-hmm. And this would date to when?
Probably about 700 years ago. So it's sort of at the later end of the occupation of the site. This was found near a hearth at the site, and it's a pretty decaying artifact, but we believe it's a pestle. The tip of the pestle shows some grinding and polishing, and as I said, it was found right near a hearth where we have evidence of some cooking, and it may have been burned. It's really decaying. The rock has become quite powdery almost. But it's a pretty good example of a pestle. Probably used to grind corn, which we did recover at the site, or perhaps acorns or hickory nuts or other seeds. And the preservation of the site is so excellent that we have found charred nut husks and burned corn and small seeds.
Fred, how was the site discovered?
It was discovered in May when Donnie Williams, who works for Paul Daniels, was putting in a septic system here, and he came down about a meter and excavated in a meter and found the shell. And then he reported it to Jan Cruzen and Gail Rainey, who own the property, and they in turn contacted the museum, and we've been working here since May. So it's really Donnie that deserves the credit for the discovery, and then of course the two women that own the property for being so cooperative and really, in fact, encouraging the whole project. So now you see what we want to do is find that first line, the top line, all the way across. Yeah, going back to 1 meter. Okay? Yeah. Three.
$81, $85,
Yeah. Okay.
$84.
And then it just runs into,
And then it runs into the bank here.
okay, so that's where that runs in then.
Yeah, because
Okay.
the meter, 3 meters, is just a little past the slope. So you want where it hits the banking here?
Okay.
80. 85.
How significant a site is this?
It's like a lot of others on the Cape. It's a shell midden, which is a domestic area, living area. It was first occupied 3,500 years ago, we think, and probably occupied up until 400 or 500 years. And I think the real significance of it is that it's really well preserved because it's buried under a meter of slope wash and historic fill.
And it's pretty extensive too. You seem to think it goes beyond what we can see right here at this.
Yeah, it looks like it probably extends south to the road and probably up the hill behind us to the north. And next year, during the testing, we'll look for the site bounds using shovel test pits.
Mm-hmm. How long have you've worked here for the balance of the summer?
Yeah,
or a good portion of the
basically
summer?
the whole summer. It took us about a month just to set everything up, establish the grid, move the back dirt, clean the profiles, and then the last 2 months we've actually been doing the excavation.
Uh-huh. How common is a site like this, either discovered or undiscovered, in the Orleans area? Is this a...
I think if you consider the general area of Town Cove, Pleasant Bay, any major estuary, you're going to find sites like this. And in fact, you could almost think of the shoreline of the major estuaries as being archaeological sites, continuous archaeological sites.
Does this have a freshwater attraction somewhere?
It does. Uncle Harvey's Pond is right across the road, so we're within 1,000 feet of fresh water, which is a very typical, in terms of locating sites. Generally, if you're within 1,000 feet of fresh water, you have a good chance of finding a site.
And what are some of the things that you found in this dig?
Stone tools, bone tools, pottery sherds, ceramic sherds, lots and lots of preserved animal bone, plant and animal bone.
You like that?
Wow. What's the paddle part of it?
Found it down in the,
You make a
Northeast
paddle
Park.
and it's wrapped
That's
with
the
a
biggest
cord
piece we
wrap.
found,
I
isn't
think so, yeah, cord wrapped fabric. And it's,
Oh, beautiful.
Striations on
So I want to congratulate you on the most readable of the articles so far.
That's a piece of pottery?
it. Yeah, yeah.
probably more.
We like the
You see the
narrative
design on it?
aspect of it. At least I vote for that every time.
It was like reading a historical
Yeah.
novel.
Yeah.
It's a sixth sense, finding the artifact and just homing in on it and grabbing the artifact right out. Yeah.
What have you found so far?
Well, I found corn, and we were talking about the projectile.
Mm-hmm.
There's a point down there. There was a stone tool down there, and that big piece of ceramic that I showed. What else have we found? A lot of bone. Have found some jaws and stuff like that. Like one was a canine jaw, and one is probably a rodent jaw. We found a small calf skull,
Wow.
probably from the farm that was here in 1600, and a lot of flakes from them making their points and stuff like that, and the pottery.
What's interesting about a midden is it's refuse that accumulates over time, but more than that, a midden is an area where activity takes place. So when you look at it, you don't have a homogeneous pile. What you really have is areas like, for instance, there's clay here in this part of the site, and that occurs in different areas, and we're wondering what that is. Is it prepared living floors, house floors? Where we find the clay, we find very little shell. And so perhaps what they've done is cleared areas, domestic areas, living areas, and then piled the shell elsewhere. So the differentiation within the midden is really a reflection of the behavior that's taking place. This is rich clay, very fine, silty clay with lots of burned shell and charcoal in it, and it extends over to here. Below it we have some red earth, some oxidized earth, probably from burning. The clay extends to the south. There's very little shell accumulation in the area where the clay is, as opposed to further north where the shell is quite dense, 20 centimeters or so, 20, 25 centimeters. The other thing that's interesting is this is a 4-meter profile, and you can see how variable the accumulation of shell is in just that small area. Within the midden, there also are features such as pits. This is a pit. You can see the slope of the shell here. Pit, probably the top of it, is within the midden, right in here. And this is a mass of both quahog and soft-shelled clam that was placed into that pit, probably a refuse pit. Maybe originally a storage pit, and once that function was served and completed, we had refuse thrown in a storage pit. We draw plan views that show the site sort of from a bird's eye perspective, and then we get this vertical perspective by drawing the distinct stratigraphic levels. Here is what we think is accumulated fill and slope wash. There's an area of mottled earth here that we think is the original ground surface. Then we have some black greasy midden with shell. And below that, more mottling due to the leaching that occurs. It's chemically altered soil. And then the B horizon, the substrate. 3,500 years ago, the occupation was pre-shell midden. The shellfish beds in Pleasant Bay probably weren't established because the people that lived here from, say, 3,500 years ago to 1,500 years ago were not bringing shellfish here. And so I think the material from 3,500 years ago has been found down in here below the midden. So we have sort of what we can look at, I think, and I hope we'll be able to do this, is look at the changing environment, or the developing estuary. And we may be able, using the archaeological evidence, to date the original and initial formation of the shellfish beds in Pleasant Bay. In 1986, I did a study of Pleasant Bay for the Friends of Pleasant Bay, looking at the distribution of archaeological sites around the bay. And in our study, we identified 72 individual prehistoric sites around the greater Pleasant Bay estuary system. But more importantly, I think we could conclude from that work that, in a sense, the entire bay shoreline is a single site. One of the areas on the bay that is most interesting is a place called Port Inimicut. And many people think that there was an individual group of people that lived there called the Port Inimicut Indians. And what really happened is that there were the Nauset Indians to the north and the Monomoyet to the south. During the time the Outer Cape was being purchased by the people from Plymouth Colony, Port Inimicut was a place that was set aside for displaced native peoples to go and live. And there was a native preacher there, and it was sort of modeled, in a sense, after an English community or an English town. They had their own constable, and there were very, very successful people that lived there. There's a very famous family. The original name is Adaman Chasik, and later became shortened to Adaman, and they had large orchards, apple orchards, and they had a farm, and he had sons that went to sea. One of them was lost at sea. Others were whalers out of Billingsgate, so that was a very successful family.
Do you know where that site might be in this Pleasant Bay area?
No, we don't have any idea of where things were in Port Inimicut, nor are we actually sure what the bounds of Port Inimicut were. It was sort of a pie-shaped wedge that ran from the bay into the area of Cliff Pond, and some of the latest period, late 17th, early 19th century Native American farmsteads were actually up in the area of Cliff Pond.
So Don Williams originally found the site, excavating here.
Yep. In what, May of '91?
Yeah, it was early spring.
Yeah, it was May of '91.
It was because Gale's septic system wasn't working properly, so they had to put in a Title V system.
Mm-hmm.
And I came in to do test holes with the engineer, and by doing the test holes, I found a shell like 3 feet down. I hit shell, and then we moved over 10 feet and did another hole, found more shell, and then moved over again and found more shell. So just from what little experience I've had with Indian sites and stuff like that, I knew that this was an exceptionally big area.
Yeah.
And then Gail was here with the engineers when I was digging the hole, so she got to see, or I got to tell her, the whole background and the history behind it, and she got interested in it. And so that's when she went and contacted the state, but they ran out of funds or something, right?
Well, they can't do anything. The state doesn't have authority over this because it's private property. So there was really nobody would have done anything really except the museum because it's outside the review process.
Oh yeah. Well, the state came down.
Lenny came, right? Or George Stilson came.
It was whoever was in control of the dig down in East End.
That's George Stilson. That's
okay.
Yeah,
I think that's the story.
Yeah.
He came down and he dug a couple test pits, and he was really interested in it.
Yeah.
But then he called back several days later and said they ran out of state funds and they couldn't do it. And so that's when Gail got a hold of you, I believe,
right? Yep.
And,
With your work with excavating, you found quite a number of sites in town, haven't you?
I've been all 25 years, and so with all the excavation that I've done, I found many, many, many sites, but nothing like this one.
Wow.
Oh, this is the biggest shell heap that I found around Orleans.
Cape Cod Photo and Art, Orleans Camera and Video. God, everybody's helped out. All you had to do was ask. Ryder and Wilcox came out one day this spring to shoot in a line for us.
Oh yeah.
Everybody just helps.
That's great.
Yeah, so it's
That's
been
what-
really good.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah, so everybody got together on that, which was good.
Don's the guy that started it all.
Yeah.
So
Well-
you learned quite a bit from
Oh yeah,
this then.
tremendous amount. Yeah.
That's good.
That's good.
That's the most important shell midden I ever worked at, that's for sure.
Really?
Yeah. Port of Nemicut was an important place as a native community during the 18th century, late 17th century, and then through the 18th century, and perhaps into the early 19th century. Pleasant Bay began to develop as an estuary probably after 4,000 years ago. Sea level stabled about 3,500 years ago. The Nauset Barrier spit was formed, and then behind it the protected embayment. And so the bay was a very important source of resources for native peoples after 3,500 years ago. And the entire bay shoreline consists of numerous archaeological sites.